or 10 minutes to good afternoon. We are starting out with the session Realizing of Russian Dream, availability of high-quality housing for the Russians. We have full house not only in the conference room, but also amongst the panelists. Two people are missing, but let's proceed with the following time limit: 5 minutes for each comment, to leave some time at the end of the session for questions and answers. So during our meeting, please prepare your questions for you to be able to ask our speakers at the end. Home ownership is the basis of all developed economies. It determines purchasing capacity and demographics. As an example of its importance during global financial crisis, and I was at the time at the Citibank in New York, the Federal Reserve System chose accessibility and availability of housing as their major priority. And most of the large banks received a phone call from their supervisors not to foreclose the tenants that were in arrears in paying for their fare. One other priority was buying for the books of the central bank or the Federal Reserve 22 billion worth of papers. It's $500 billion. And we are in the 5th year of the financial crisis, and only now the reduction of these mortgage papers started. Let me introduce to you all of our speakers as we discuss issues. Russian citizens received as a legacy of the Soviet Union privatized homes. 85% of the population are homeowners, which is much higher than the average across Europe or in the United States, where 65% are homeowners. However, the housing stock in Russia is obsolete, much more obsolete, and the housing space per capita is much lower. Average across Russia, 23 square meters per capita. Even in China, 25. In Brazil, 40, and the United States, 65 square meters per capita. Of course, the problem is still acute in providing our citizens with accessible housing. Well, the following speakers will correct me if I'm wrong or will support me in my contention that in 2013, Russian construction industry commissioned 70.5 million square meters, which is a record even for the Soviet Union times. In spite of all this, the problem of collapsing housing is still on the agenda, and we can say that such an offer is not sufficient to provide the middle class with all the regulatory requirements in space per capita. I will proceed with discussion, if you don't mind. We have 3 Alexanders and amongst the panelists. They are all government officials. We're hopeful. Okay, let's proceed from Alexander Albertovich Plutnikov, who is Deputy Minister of Construction of the Russian Federation and Housing Utilities too. And he is in the business for quite some time, and before he was appointed to the ministry, he was assistant to Mr. Shuvalov, first vice president, vice chairman of the government, and he was in charge of construction matters. So the question is quite general in nature, as an introduction into our discussion, how the government views the housing situation in Russia, and based on that, what is the role of the government in stimulating this sector if needed, and some of the vectors in the development or instrumentation. I will be as brief as possible to enable everybody to speak and to answer questions. According to the social polls, about 60% of Russian families want improvement in their housing conditions. So they have the dream on our agenda. And the government provides necessary assistance to the citizens that wish to improve their housing. But in order for us to be able to improve housing for our citizens, we should build more. Last year, 70.5 million square meters were built. Half of them were individual housing, and the other half is industrial buildings. And the housing is 50% of the housing is economy class, which is more required in our country. And the Ministry of Construction is faced with the problem of how to create conditions to develop construction industry, not only economy class housing, but all other housing units. We have adopted a federal program, Housing for the Russians, which is a guaranteed purchase out of the housing built up to 30,000 rubles per square meter, and assistance in mortgage lending, and to buy out the engineering infrastructure that is going to be connected, 4,000 in the amount of 4,000 rubles per square meters. We are now selecting the projects for the purpose, which will be listed in the executive order of the minister for the construction. Some of the regions will be free to provide assistance to their citizens from municipal and regional budgets, which will make housing for our citizens more affordable. What do we do to simplify construction procedures and to make the housing more affordable? We will reduce administrative barriers. Before we proceeded, the procedure comprised about 220 clearance requirements that needed to be cleared. Some of them were related to the area development, to territorial development, to running water and electricity connections, and so on. But in total, there were 220 approvals. Now we have 134 procedures. This is a scary figure, and we believe that within the next 6 months we will reduce it down by 40 procedures, and we will come up with 80 procedures, and no municipalities or regional authorities will be allowed to add more procedures, and this list will be comprehensive and common for all regions. Regions differ in the number of procedures that need to be approved. Some of the regions have advanced in their struggle against administrative barriers. They began this fight a few years ago together with the World Bank, and the World Bank recognizes the progress in our regions in reduction of administrative barriers in construction. So these are two programs that we have already started to implement, and we will provide support to the developers, and we will certainly increase our competition between regional developers, despite the fact that some of them have a large share in the market. It's good, but we need to have new players coming into the market, new companies, young companies with other profit margins and other organization structure. We have discussed with the World Bank the organization of construction companies active on the Russian market. There are plenty of such companies that have very complicated organizational structures. We are of the opinion that the competitive advantage should be held by those that disclose their organizational structure and shareholders that can apply for loans under transparent conditions in the banks. And we believe that, in general, if we discuss share participation in construction projects, only transparent companies should have access to shareholders' money. We are beginning to work on it. We appreciate that it is impossible for the market to provide free share participation in any company. It means that any of us can establish a company and to collect full-scale, full amounts of money to start construction project, and all the risks should to be held by the citizens. Only professional and duly cleared construction companies should have access to, and all the others should go to the bank. This is the job that we believe is necessary to accomplish. Thank you, Alexander. Your presentation should be elaborated, I think, by the second Alexander Arnoldovich Braverman, Director General of the Federal Fund of the Assistance to the Development of Housing Construction, because pursuing the logic of your presentation, one of the specific issues that you have just touched upon is related to commissioning of economy class housing. As my understanding is correct, this is the mission of the fund. Alexander, if you could briefly discuss, for the benefit of our participants, the mission of the fund, the major achievements since it was established, and priorities to pursue in the future, and should we expect any breakthrough in commissioning economy class housing? Distinguished colleagues, Viatcheslav, original mission of the fund in 2008 was very simple: to try to develop the land that were owned by state unitary companies, ministries, departments, and to provide them for the developers. The mission evolved with time, and currently our mission is measured not with hectares that we provide to the developers, but rather commissioned space, housing space, because we proceed from bottom to top together with the developers. Because the developers normally initiate such projects, and our federal law is structured in a way that any entity should apply for the fund money, and nothing will prevent him or her from getting the funds. I cannot provide any self-appreciation, but I have the numbers in our reports. They are publicly accessible. We report to both chambers of the federal government, federal parliament, to the government, and to the office of the president, and according to Kommersant, it issued an annual interview which covers these issues. Today, the development terms is 5 to 6 times shorter than is the average for 2.1 times, as is the case with subfederal or municipal ownership. They are measured by 2.3 million, and the current year we are planning on commissioning the same amount. Municipal housing is dominating. Its share in the projects already implemented or currently being implemented will amount to some 70%. As the land parcels are developed, the pressure will be put through demand, through supply on demand, and I'm in complete agreement with Alexander Albertovich, who has been with us for 7 years, including 2 years in the commission of the president, which initiated the conclusion by the president that the fund was relevant and that it should be established. So we coincide, including in our appreciation. 61% of the population, according to our assessment, is prepared to improve their housing conditions, and most of the population target economy class housing, and the demand, which is supported by the purchasing capacities, is 175 million square meters. And it's not about wishful thinking. But we are aware of the sources that the population is prepared to fund their improvement projects, like sale of their available apartments and using it as an initial participation, and the demand for the mortgage loans is expanding. 75 million square meters is a large amount, and it's a huge stake for the developers. Now back to the procedures. What has been done in the short time by the Ministry of Construction is as an element of an administrative heroic deed, if I may say so. So if any one of you just happen to come across one procedure, you should understand now if it's, as promised, the number of procedures will be 80 in number. It's then the procedure of getting all the construction permits will become mechanistic in a good sense of the word. So the job done by the ministry is good. Now we have been discussing the cutoff levels for specific categories of developers in terms of using the population's money. It's not an urgent, it's an absolutely indispensable measure. We should remove from the market the companies that are fraudulent and, in a sense, to demonopolize the market. The demonopolization should proceed by providing land parcels in amounts to generate competition between big and medium-sized companies. We have built our structure to target it, and bearing in mind our purpose of commissioning, we came to the level of 32.5. For a business to have 4 or 5 years to develop the parcels with an adequate profit margin and revenue. And we already have many companies that compete between themselves. Alexander mentioned the transparency that should be the most important component of such companies, and we will discuss tomorrow, like Sinara development, a Volgograd colleague of ours. They begin from apartment planning and marketing, and it enabled the company in a short period of time at a price much lower, much below the market price, to sell their housing space, commissioned housing space, and most of them are studios that are sort of the first apartment for a young family. And we, together with our colleagues from the Ministry of Construction and developers, believe that this approach should be replicated. The company that Alexander has been describing, it's an open company, and it discloses all of its indicators, and whatever we maintain and provide support together with our with savings bank, and we thereby improve access to loans, and the effective credit rate is much below than across the market. Many gadgets are employed to improve it. And we are part of a program, which is now on our agenda, or part of the dream. So it will substantially reduce the complexity of our task.
And you do remember about our main problem, poor management and bad roads. We confront two basic issues, and these two problems, land and infrastructure. It appears that in such multitude of different land resources, and there is no problem of providing vast spaces, but when we try to arrange the screening, be that social infrastructure, and someone doesn't want to build engineering infrastructure is the second problem. If there is a patch of land, but the people do not want to go there for municipality, doesn't develop living quarters construction, and such a comprehensive development where labor could be attached, where living quarters are available, where there is a place for recreation, and this is the cluster approach, and also superclusters in Novosibirsk, partially in Volgograd. We have the same in Chelyabinsk in the Far East. We don't have too many of clusters of that kind, but we understand how to replicate these projects, and we have no ministry, and we have no doubt that this program potentially will be definitely accomplished. Thank you very much, Alexander Arnolevich. As we touched upon the topic, as it is being offered, so let's talk about the offer and then continue with the demand. And probably it will be interesting. We have two representatives of private developing companies, Leonid Kozinets and Veniamin Golubitsky. I believe it would be most interesting to hear from the people who do it by their own hands, and they confront most various types of problems which were just announced, and briefly to hear about their experience and about their vision, how to help this sector and to commission larger volumes of living quarters. And by passing the floor to Leonid Alexandrovich, I would like to remind that he made his own contribution and also into the work of the government commission to reduce these administrative barriers. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. And having analyzed the headline of this title about the Russian dream, and Khrushchev once said communism is a line on a horizon, and horizon is an imaginary line which couldn't be achieved. So it's the same. True with this dream and happiness. We have to work hard to achieve it, although horizon couldn't be reached, but the reference point we have chosen, you could approach them. And where is an opportunity to buy an apartment? I recollect the phrase of our competitors from Britain, and perhaps as most of we are not friends or enemies, we are competitors for resources. You have what you pay. And who is paying and what we are paying for when we talk about living quarters? First of all, let's understand what kind of living quarters we build. We have two news. There are no breakthrough technologies, and I've been studying for 2 years what kind of secret technologies in China. They are building 1 billion square meters a year, and what kind of Turkish subcontractors who are making with high quality of $400 per square meters for you have to understand that there are municipal quality and some allied quality. It's very difficult to achieve that quality for a fairly conservative amount of money. And sometimes the quality of doors and other things, they're much cheaper. And Turkey also is subsidizing some export operations, and they get a rebate on the price for 30%. So what we are doing is a question to our government and reduction of costs at every stage of construction. And now subcontractors and developers, they could afford losing a lot of money while economy afforded to sell a lot, and they have chosen not optimal solutions. But this happy life is now over, and for architects, when they design the house, we will draw a beautiful house, a modern. And we are working with Americans. They are giving specifications of the equipment, and you could calculate even including one bolt. And that's the way the developers are choosing today, and this is the only way to calculate costs as per the cost of even one nut or bolt in order to approach a reasonable cost per square meter. And if the designer is not capable to do that within these limits, you don't have to work. And who is paying? Unfortunately, either the end user or the state will be paying, and there are no third players, no extraterrestrial creatures would be able to approach us and pay for that kind of living quarters. So we are going to pay for it, and if the end user is going to pay for it, those definitely this is the mortgage program with the support of a state or a bank, and I'm sure my colleagues would continue to elaborate on this. And there is also a limit on elasticity, and if there are no support and the person is not buying it, so he will never buy it at all. And the costs components, first of all, this is the time, and if 50% of money is made on design stage, so if it is made during 1 year, that's good. If it is 5 years, this is cheaper than the cost of the bank credit. But this is the matter of time. And of course, when you minimize the time, and what our colleagues talk about, a lot of time has been spent, and I'm sure even more is going to be spent to reduce and to have these administrative barriers transparent, easy to understand. But everyone takes 2 days to overcome. That is very reasonable. But having bought a patch of land at an auction, but you spend years in order to straighten out for everything. So, and it takes 4 or 5 years to construct the structure. So it prevents us from going into this project. And even if the mortgage is fairly reasonable, but the time is not reasonable. And this is the headache of the federal government. And the list of administrative procedures are being elaborated by the federal government. And if the state has a will, it should express its will And this will is expressed that no region is capable of developing something of their own. That's the end of the story. If you want to propose something, but you propose it to the ministry, and you have to discuss it with the ministry, and you may add these procedures, but you have to do that in full coordination with the government at the legal basis. Secondly, if there is a will on behalf of the state, it should develop the state program for development of the territories. For developing a vast territory sometimes is ignored. And those pilot projects, they're few, and we don't understand completely everywhere. The state is responsible for comprehensive development of, let's say, territories, 500 or be that thousands. The network is created and lots are also provided, and to develop 1,000 hectares of construction with infrastructure, roads, and no power plants, they cannot do that. It's not exactly their function. And extensive construction works on this territory, yes, that's his responsibility, and you can finance the infrastructure creation, the social infrastructure, jobs, sporting facilities. Yes, this is part of the project, and there should be a warranty to compensate for this, and commissioning of vast territories should be done simultaneously. Nobody's developing sports facilities with no inhabitants around, so that's how the vast spaces should be managed. And of course, the work of the builders and developers who do not have to wait, but to propose public-private partnership. And Alona Nikolaev, she's the strong supporter of the PPP projects, and will come back with the ministry and talk about this. What the state guarantees to the business when business is solving certain problems. And we can go back to the issues that the Ministry of Building and Utilities, they don't have specific funds for comprehensive development of projects, which will be further sold on the market, both of the living quarters and, of course, networking companies with very high profitability. That's our money they collected from the population when they use this money for their own development, for capital repair, and for the profit to shareholders. For if the state has a policy of its own, so let's negotiate with them that they are supposed to invest money into the development of the capacities on new territories, be that auctions or some other methods of support, and they would also have money for development of engineering facilities in vast territories. For you cannot cover the costs of developing vast territories at their own expense. Now, talking about the networking company, we have to have two levels. At the level of the subjects and federal, and the governors have to bear personal responsibility. And if we have to develop 100 million square meters, and let's understand what are the plans of the regions, and if they want to commission less than 100 million, so in this case, the country will not get this amount of housing. And if the governor says, here, I'm going to build such and such number, but as a summary, they fail to accomplish this program, it will never happen. So my message to the federal government and perhaps to the president, so the government have to be personal responsible for execution of these programs, and you have to assess the capacity of your region to understand the trends all over the company and the country, and the norms for commissioning of living quarters would be such and such. And you have to deal with the networking companies, you have to regulate the tariffs, and the governor knows where he's got land with boundaries, delineation, and if he is properly asked, he will find lots of lands. It's not just some kind of individual is talking to the government. Of course, he hasn't got any leverage on this boss. But if it is coming from the government, so if you fail to commission 3 million square meters next year, you will be considered inefficient manager and administrative barriers. But when we compare different regions and the developer comes and everything goes easy, and sometimes in a different place he confronts very serious obstacles. But if the governor is rated with specific number of KPIs, his behavior will be different. Thank you. Veniamin Maksovich, I'll try to be as brief as possible. So Leonid facilitated my mission, and he is like a coordinator of the developing sector, and perhaps he deserves some kind of applause. And I'd like to be as brief as possible. And of course, when we talk about this, there are no wonders in this respect in terms of costs. Having traveled the world around, and I can tell you that it doesn't mean that we cannot reduce costs or develop a civilized market, but actually the key to success, if you are talking about the dream is environment and life standard. This dream may be different. If the person is sober, it somehow attributes this to the amount of money which he has. And unfortunately, I cannot share the viewpoint that the governor is properly pressed. No, I don't think they will be able to do something practical. So it's fairly hard to get this result by using administrative pressure. And I believe the comprehensive development of the area is the key. And I can tell you, I will thank you when we are going to have a law on public-private partnership. For the state has a limited amount of resources, and we don't have investors who can invest with 5% profitability. No wonders will happen here, and the key is the comprehensive development. Our legal framework and the units to measure it may be most different. And I discussed that with Alexander, and we tried to include that into the legal framework, but as long as the huge projects could not be accepted as a unit of measurement and efficiency, we won't accomplish anything, because sometimes the state, the governor, the utilities bodies are participating, and he is not a major figure here. And sometimes people are waiting for a kind governor to intervene. No, that will not work. Life demonstrates different all successes when the project itself is becoming a unit of measurements, and when some specific projects are being executed but manages to achieve this result. So this is very important. And the second, the concentration of resources. The state doesn't have enough money, and investors are extremely cautious behaving in this turmoil economic situation. There are regional and federal governments, then branch programs. The school is built in one place. The hospital is in different. Everybody is solving its budgetary task. And in order to concentrate the resources is the most important thing. You have to concentrate your efforts and social sites in the points of growth where we have labor, land, and investors. And should that happen, it will work. You will find the money and the conditions of deficiency of financial resources. Concentration is very important. Of course, when we talk about the dream, it consists of many things. We don't have the operating companies. That could be done on the vast projects. You cannot do that on one single building. For if this is the only house with deteriorated and obsolete utilities, that will not work. But there are different things with high technologies and high education. People are working there desperately, and they pay 20 or 30% less than the average in the region. The same is security. If you want to create the security service, how much would be the cost of such service? But when the volumes are big, that could be accomplished. Video surveillance or some kind of emergency squads, and the same is environmental conditions. Now, as long as we don't say what is the unit of measurement, what are the minimum volumes, we will be destined to failure, and we won't be able to create the product which will be in demand. And still we have a gap in our legislation, and we've been talking about it for 7 years. And I believe the breakthrough effort is the law which was adopted, living quarters for a Russian family. And the number of square meters and no quality characteristics and no proper content, and 25,000. It's the correlation of time and money. And here it is also very important. And if during this program you split it, so we have to talk nothing about. And as long as we are not concentrated on the consumers' requests and demands in terms of money, and in that financial side, what kind of a maximum could be afforded, like the social and engineering service, we won't move further a step. And I'm sure we will fail to solve these issues. Just one comment. I will be an opponent to Braverman. I did not suggest the governors to be punished, but they have to be somehow reprimanded for failures to achieve practical results. Of course, governors alone will not be able to solve this problem, but if from the level of the government or president there will be some kind of criteria of assessment and properly chosen the points how to measure the practical results, so again we will not be able to achieve our goal. And I will continue. Maybe my colleagues will not support me here, even if I couldn't talk them into my idea that the government has to define on each specific region very well-weighted and well-grounded numbers of commissioning of housing for every territory. And Otherwise, if there are no strong efforts from every region and they will not have coordinated numbers for commissioning. So in this case, the State Planning Commission of the Soviet Union wasn't exactly a useless body where the planning for construction of living quarters was properly set, and conversation went on in the regions, and if they fail to do that, they are supposed to be somehow reprimanded and punished. Of course, I believe the governors, they are fairly experienced managers, and they really want to develop their own regions. Nobody just claimed that they are not interested in developing housing programs. 25,000 meters, you said it's nothing, but for some kind of a region, it's really a serious number. It depends on the subjects we talk about. Besides, some companies will not be involved or interested, but some will believe that this is a fairly good chunk of money. And if this price is okay for one companies, they would go into these projects. Of course, now we have collected the applications from different companies to participate in 25 million square meters. In a week's time, we have received the applications for 21 million square meters. And this is 100 billion rubles. They will go to these subjects, to Tatarstan, Novosibirsk, to Chechen Republic. And so it means that other subjects will execute different other projects. We still have 15 minutes, and we talked about the proposal and offer. Now I'm giving the floor to Mr. Semenyaka. He's in charge of the agency of mortgage loans, and the policy here was changed. And if we're talking about the loss of inflation, we witnessed the growth of inflation, which was officially acknowledged up to the level of 7.5%. Naturally, it affects the mortgage interest loans, and as Alexander Arnoldovich explained, mortgage loans are very elastic, and in the context of this macroeconomic dynamics, what do we see in the housing and utilities construction, how to reduce the interest in loans, and what is your assessment of this phenomenon, and what is the position of private investors?
Thank you for your question. In effect, the external lending resources are very limited for us, so internal sources become more important, like the Bank of Russia and the pensions. We see our objective in preventing the interest rates from growing, and we believe that our most important objective is to reduce, to improve to the flow of high rate collaterals or securities. Today, the bonds for mortgage lending is equal to about 250 billion, and they are already listed as the most important program of the federal format. And one more approach is to increase the number of banks. Not only big banks, but medium-sized banks should have the opportunity to refinance. This is just about a short-term liquidity improvement. It is good, but the systemic approach should be transferring the pension savings to the non-pension, the non-government-owned entities. Of course, certain regulatory stimulation should be in place and toolage that would protect from inflation. We should retain the mortgage lending rate at the same level as we did last year. According to our records, some of the borrowers wanted to take advantage of the improved mortgage rates that were available at the beginning. And we want to improve our building capacity and form the demand for lease housing to offer affordable lending schemes in order to be able, in addition to the demand generated by mortgage of the citizens, to form the demand from the investors. In this area, we want to proceed as follows: to develop a standard of the contract, lease contract, that would provide a balance between the interests of the investors, owners, and the lenders, in order for us to be able to issue the most reliable tranches, even if the occupancy rate is not sufficient, and if we distribute the profitability across the board. And the government, if it is required to repay the non-pension funds, to be able to have their money back through different tools, like, for instance, infrastructure bonds. The supply side is better off in this sense, because we do not include infrastructure into the price of the housing. So if we enable return of or repayment of the debt through the tariffs, it will enable us to reduce the cost of construction. So there's a need for a clear-cut toolage that would be interesting for the pension fund owners and the investors. But the investors are represented in low amounts. We have quite a few questions, and we have 2 more speakers. Please be as brief as possible. Rubena Avgan-Began, the chairman of the board of the Financial Corporation Discovery. It's one of the biggest non-government pension funds and shareholder in the Bank Anonymous. Please briefly comment on the share of the securities in the portfolio of your pension fund, and how can they be compared with the government-owned portfolios, and how you survive in competition with the government funds and banks? Yes, briefly. Too many questions to cover. Our biggest private bank group are active in the market. We believe in the market, and we believe that our borrowers treat these loans as they're adequate. We are one of the biggest banks in lending in the whole of the cycle, we welcome the initiatives about developing competition and transparency of the sector, because we as a lending banker are clear-cut beneficiary. Regarding the rates, a good idea about NPF. Alexander Arnolievich was talking about the cheap money in the funds. Albertovich, I'm sorry. We spent some time in discussing it, and some of the illusions disappeared. Non-pension funds are not cheap in providing their money, and because their toolage is quite competitive. So if we hope for cheap pension money to jump into this market, I don't think it's reasonable. So far as the federal program is duly adhered to, it's a good idea to invest money, but the pension money is year-long. Who of you want to go out on a pension in 1 year? But the investment of this money have a 1-year horizon, but the federal government has a program to extend the term. But if the competitive field and other tools will occupy 9th or 10th place in profitability, what do we do? How the government can try to return some of the programs on stimulating mortgage or subsidizing rates, then it may be a workable solution. But it's a clear-cut problem that requires our attention, and pretty comprehensively. Regarding the refinancing of the Bank of Russia, this is the idea that needs to be developed, but the Bank of Russia is reluctant to go ahead with long-term funding. They can provide some 5 or 7 days or month, 3 months, but we should provide funding for a 10 or 15-year projects at least. An average number is different, but mentally, a human being can or wants to have a loan for 10 or 20 years, but tends to repay it earlier than that. We need to concentrate our attention on solving this problem. I have been listening to punishing governors or not punishing them. I believe that such things, most of them, will be dealt with when the mechanism of demand will be streamlined, because it's the biggest driver for moving ahead. You can have an objective of building millions of square meters of space, but if you cannot lease it out or you can't sell it, it's like goes down the drain. So it's an important factor. Back to your question about the possibility of competition with the government banks. In our understanding, it is possible, although it's a difficult arrangement, but the system that is available today in the government is very powerful in stimulating government-owned participants, and this is the biggest problem that our government faces. If we have a construction committee, a government-owned committee, it will be sitting here, and all the other participants will be elsewhere. The state banks have a lower interest rate on funding. What we can be competitive with is our convenience, our operational speed and the limits that the borrower will be patient to have. I am all for going back to the programs of stimulating large amounts of banks through different refinancing vehicles. De facto, they equalize us all, although it's a bad idea, but then we will have a realistic tool to fight for our clients, because people want to increase their living space. A small remark to what Ruben spoke about. I'm in complete agreement with him on 2 points. And this trend has been around from 2006 or 2007. We were parting in the way. We faced two models when the housing stock was getting underway. A Canadian mortgage housing corporation, which takes from the land parcel and condominium, and it provides services. So Ruben is correct in assuming that, of course, we have an agreement with Gazprom and gas region supplies. We also have an arrangement with our savings bank and other banks. We are well off, yes, but we don't have any competition. It means that we have to pull out a land parcel which is being developed in cooperation with the banks. And the second thing that needs to be to agree, the demand should be incentivized, because we market our projects on the level of federation, region, and construction site on 3 levels on a regular basis. 75 million square meters of living space requires stimulation. Tim Nicol, managing director of Rusables, is an expert in securitization.
Set up a number of black bullet points. What you think, as a conclusion, key recommendations maybe that the government in Russia could use to stimulate the housing market in Russia?
Thank you, Slava. I hope that's okay. I think we have to be careful what we wish for. For example, making money cheaper, as we experience in the UK, just puts up the price of real estate. So it doesn't actually help. At the same time, just increasing the supply of real estate doesn't actually translate into successful development and successful new housing if people can't afford to buy the result. So what you have is supply and demand. From my perspective, I'm a financier. I've been financing mortgages around the world for 25 years. And I've been involved in the Russian capital markets now for nearly 10 years. My observations are quite simple. There's $50 billion of mortgages being created in 2014. Russia does not have a savings industry, pensions and insurance companies, that can absorb this volume of financing. Fixing that issue is a different problem, and a very big problem for Russia. So Russia probably has to do something different. It's not a matter of creating just securities and thinking someone's going to buy them, because the people to buy them aren't out there. So securities have to be created which the government will support with liquidity by making them available for repo, putting them on the Lombard list. These are actions of the central bank. So what we're able to do, the problem we face here is we have long-term assets and we have short-term money, because there's not enough long-term money, as Ruben was saying. So how do we bridge the difference between long-term assets and short-term money? Well, the government provides liquidity to make the difference work. There's two ways they can do that. One way is helping my industry, which is securitization. And the government's done a lot of very good things. We have a securitization law. We have a lot of practice now at developing bonds. But supply is very low because it's expensive, and actually there aren't very many investors. So there's another thing the government can do, which actually doesn't help me as an individual, as an investment banker, which is to change the definition of N4. N4 is one of the normative ratios central banks use to manage short-term assets, short-term funding, deposits, and long-term lending, like loans, mortgage loans. And at the moment, mortgage loans are treated entirely as very long-term loans for a bank. So a bank cannot fund its mortgage business with retail deposits. Now, in England, we built our mortgage industry with retail deposits. It's how our industry started and works today. With the efforts of Viatcheslav, we have a liquid market in mortgage assets. If we change the definition of N4 to allow mortgage assets to be treated with haircuts as a short-term asset, we can use retail money, retail deposits to fund mortgage business, and we'll introduce all the competition that we want to see in the market. What we don't have today is competition. We don't need cheaper money, because that just puts up prices of real estate, just makes developers wealthy. What we need is competition and choice and service and flexibility. 70% of the mortgage loans come from 3 banks. This is not great at all. So Vladislav's question, I'm finishing right now, is a simple one. What should happen? Well, we need to be pragmatic. Russia is different to other countries. It came to this point from a different direction. There's a simple thing that can be done. We should do it. We'll get better and more efficient financing as a result.
Tim, thank you very much. I think this N4 recommendation is a very interesting one and needs to be heard. So luckily we have here 3 representatives of the state here to deliver the message. У нас время закончилось, но мы обещали.
Unfortunately, we are already through with our session. Some of the questions remained unanswered. Please ask them, and to whom. First, I am thankful to you for indicating that private-public partnership initiatives we have a unique opportunity because we have a ministry which is a key partner of ours in promoting high quality and affordable housing in Russia. And if we are not back on private-public partnership schemes for comprehensive development of area of land, we will run the risk, and I am seeking your professional assistance from those that appreciate the absence of all kinds of projects like developing recreational and housing and utility-based services. No project will be possible. But who is competing with whom in developing high-quality housing? Unless and until we have this dacha amnesty on the agenda, or comprehensive development with spontaneous sale of housing units, which are kind of hidden behind the government construction projects, then the bona fide investor or business person is burdened with additional social infrastructure related projects by other personalities. Don't you think it's a violation of the conditions of competition and does not stimulate a comprehensive development of land? And one last thing, no investment or loan money will be available until our central bank recognizes these construction projects as high-risk operations. And it means that all banks that are expected to provide investment should provide coverage of all risks without dealing or addressing all of these issues, without honest competition to be available there. Talking about high-quality housing will be difficult. Alexander, are you going to comment on it? We have already been discussing these issues, and I don't want to take away some time that is available to us from others that want to ask a few more questions. Well, we will have to leave a space. I am from Sebastopol, a new federal city. My question evolves from Leonid's presentation, or more to it should be directed to Alexander. We need a systemic approach to our legal basis. In our Sebastopol, the acting governor stopped 40 construction projects in order to sort out construction documentation and all these things. Of course, many many developers are not bona fide, but most of them are okay. How can we describe such activities of the governor as legally sound, and what is the legislation? What does legislation talk about? It needs to be discussed in detail. Please come to the ministry and we will arrange a meeting. And one more thing. On Crimea, we have a specific instruction from the government to provide assistance, especially in construction projects. In addition to removing barriers, we have a contact with the ministry on Crimea, so the developers from Sebastopol and from Ukraine, we are prepared to go for a direct communication. Please come to see us, and we will professionally protect you, developers' interests. Thank you for an interesting discussion. Let us thank the moderators.